welcome to episode 35 of the Bamboo Chalupa Digital Marketing Podcast. I am your host, Brett Snyder. We are actually missing my co-host, Nate Shiver, today. He is out of town, but we have a special guest with us. We have David Palombo, who is the CMO of LaunchThat, a full-service digital marketing agency in Orlando, who's going to talk to us about building a brand from startup to scale. David, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yep, glad to be here, Brett.
All right, so why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, kind of your role, and what got you excited about working in the digital marketing space?
So I got started at what was a small startup in 2009, which eventually became LaunchThat. It was my final year of college, and I joined actually as an intern. Really, I was enamored with kind of the opportunities in digital marketing, learning about search algorithms, learning about kind of how digital marketing worked. And ever since then, like a lot of people in our industry, I'm basically an autodidact, kind of learned everything myself, not to diminish, the great mentors and the great people I've worked with along the way. But there's no real kind of specific kind of training that goes into kind of this industry. A lot of people stumble into it, and that's definitely my case.
And I think that was my experience as well. Actually, my first job in SEO, I thought I was going to be doing PPC because that was the experience that I had before that. And I think you have a very unique perspective here because your role kind of has a heavy focus on SEO, but you're responsible for managing all sorts of resources that exist on your team, design, development, content, paid media, outreach. And many of our listeners on the show are in a similar kind of wears multiple hats capacity, whether as sole proprietors, managers of mid-sized teams, or agency and in-house resources. So if you could talk to us a little bit about how you juggle kind of that multidisciplinary nature of digital marketing to ensure that the projects that you work on are able to deliver results.
Yeah, this changes a lot depending on the size of your team. When you are at a small company, small startup, and I got a lot of this from actually conversations that I've had with Dharmesh Shah, the CTO of HubSpot. I've been fortunate enough to have a few conversations with him, and based around this exact topic, and he's really defined it really well. But it's this idea between generalists and specialists. And when you're at a small company and you are at a small marketing team, a small startup, you will attract people that are more generalists, that can wear a lot of different hats, and that will step into each piece of the puzzle and provide an impact. And over time, what you'll find is as you kind of scale, is you'll find yourself in positions where you're going to want people who are much more specialized in one certain area. And this is a big shift in your company because not only is it a shift in the types of people and the types of roles on the team, but it is also a cultural shift, and it presents completely new challenges, communication challenges. When you have a lot of generalists and you're on a small group team, communication is not actually that big of a problem. Everybody kind of knows what's going on. And when you go more towards this specialist model, you find that really you focus more on making sure that there are processes in place where the specialist can work with other members of the team, and making everybody kind of understand the goals of a project. So a lot of what I've been doing over the past couple of years, which was different than probably my first few years working as a digital marketer, is putting people in the right spots and solving kind of challenges for people to work together. But really, results and impact are what matters. You have to make decisions that will impact the bottom line. And I'm biased towards finding solutions that allow you to scale quality. So building solid foundations for content development, tracking, testing, and being able to scale that and develop quality marketing is what I like to focus on.
And I think that whole idea of communication is really interesting between people who are in this specialist role, because you have to have the ability to help these specialists understand not only the impact of their specific focus, but what impact that's going to have on these other teams. Where I expect in your role, you have to do a lot of translation, for lack of a better phrase, where you need to be able to create a common language between the developers and the content marketers and the SEOs, so that people can actually understand when I do X, butterfly effect for the rest of the organization is actually really substantial. And I would imagine that that's got to be a major piece of the way that you've structured this team and the way that you've been able to grow and scale.
Yeah, and that communication is not something that's easy. It's something that has to be reinforced, and it has to be constant. And it's over time that people start to understand kind of the impact of their specific roles. Digital marketing is still a fairly young industry. More people understand it every day. But when, for example, we hire somebody who is a great journalist and can break news stories in industries, can make relationships, can do interviews, and you start to explain to them how digital marketing works, it takes that type of person who maybe has worked in the newspaper industry for 20, 30 years, a long time, to start to understand all the reasons why you're doing some of the things that you're doing. But over time, it improves, and you can get people to a higher level of understanding. And once they have that higher level of understanding, they're easier to work with, and you can scale quality. You can scale these types of things on your team.
Right. I know one of the things that we've talked about on the show in the past has to do with, what do you look for in somebody on that team? And I've used this phrase actually a lot more in the past couple of weeks, is being able to find the raw materials, where digital is not necessarily an entirely new medium, but it is definitely a different medium. It's definitely a different experience for the user, and it's a different means to have to go out there and produce some sort of asset that is meant to exist solely in the digital space. And so the title of today's episode, really to kind of segue from there, is we wanted to talk about building a brand from startup to scale. You've obviously had experience from, being very small to now growing the team, going from that generalist to the specialist. There's a common characteristic, that you guys want to manage the entire life cycle. It's why you want to have the different resources in place to know that you can rely on scaling quality, that you can rely on quality assurance through every step of that process, from ideation to web and content development to the marketing. And then when we get even beyond that, to the conversion rate optimization. How do you continue to iterate and improve on a daily basis? So when you're starting to look for that startup to scale, we're kind of that tipping point where you say, okay, now we're getting to the point where the engine has been built. Something that Nate and I talk about a lot is the flywheel, where it's much, much harder to get the first spin than it is to get the second and the third and the fourth. And so when you're trying to build and scale these organizations, kind of what are some of the first tactical steps that you would take to do that?
Yeah, so you want to develop a very kind of solid foundation. A lot of the technical challenges that you see when, let's say, you're in more of an agency type of situation is you see that there's a lot of kind of websites or just digital marketing strategies that don't have a solid foundation. So, and when I'm talking about a solid foundation, I'm talking about technical SEO, site architecture, user needs, understanding what users you're going to target. And, this can take a while, but I'm not really a marketer who likes to just resolve technical things forever. If you build that part right, you can get to the good stuff a lot quicker.
But I think it's essential to build that foundation.
Right.
And it's one of those things where it's so much easier to establish that on day one than to have to go back and fix that. I mean, there's a reason the foundation is kind of the go-to phrase there, and the analogy to building a home. If you are going to go half-ass on putting the foundation underneath, whatever you're going to build on top of it is going to be shaky. It's going to be unstable.
Yeah. And you're going to want, you're going to want to set up a situation where all of kind of the technical SEO stuff is resolved and has a really good foundation. You have a solid CMS infrastructure, something that, people can go in and upload and push content very easily. And you're going to want to create an ability to track data and actions with a lot of what I would call data integrity, which is being able to understand what your users are doing and being able to take actions off of that information. And if you have really good data integrity and you have the ability to track the actions that are important, that are going to happen on your digital properties, then you're going to have the foundation to start developing great content assets and launching great ideas and being able to take actions off of the results of those things. If you do not have that great foundation, then then you'll find yourself going back and completely reworking that engine. And that's where you get inefficient.
And I think you talked a little bit before about wanting to have an environment where your team can be held accountable to results. And that is that common language that we talked about, that importance on communication. So in terms of setting the expectations, because I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with, because they say, all right, I want to increase leads or I want to increase traffic. But that is a very kind of macro goal to set for people. So how do you go about setting specific and attainable expectations for your team that can then be measured against kind of some of these analytics and hold everybody accountable to those results?
So I think you start with your top of the line goals. That's usually profitability. And then you back into customer generation, lead generation, traffic, rankings, as far down the funnel as you want to get. And each piece is really important, but I like to focus on generating customers. And I think some marketers focus on things that are kind of higher up on the funnel, like lead generation or rankings. And those are great metrics. But you may fail to see a lot of really important, impactful solutions if you just focus on those metrics and you don't focus on how you're actually generating customers.
One of the things that I know that we say when people want to have that focus on rankings, and I say, all right, well, show me one of your bills you can pay with rankings, and I'll make that my primary KPI. And I think you're talking about being able to look into getting a positive return on an investment in marketing, which is, it's the lifeblood of good business. It's the difference between success and failure, to be able to have that focus on what is going to drive profitability. And I think it's very interesting. I kind of want to point out the fact that you didn't say to drive revenue, you didn't say to drive sales, but to really understand the full picture of profitability of the asset that you were trying to go and promote.
Yeah, and that's obviously super important. And that's going to be your goals if you want to have success. And the reason that I would look at customer generation as kind of a key metric is that's where you can learn a lot about your brand and your users. And it allows you to kind of make the right decisions when you're working on your property.
And I think I remember you were telling me something a couple weeks back about kind of a monthly, what I'll call a monthly State of the Union for your teams, especially with kind of the multiple roles that are playing in there, where you actually have a monthly meeting where you give people a sense of, here's what we've done, here's what it accomplished, here's what's up next. So talk to me a little bit about that, kind of what the genesis of that idea was, how I imagine that you've kind of tweaked and iterated that over time to get down to the quick hitting main points that everybody needs to know, but to eliminate all the fluff.
Yeah, so as we kind of alluded to before, communication's just super important for bigger teams. Smaller teams, everyone kind of knows what's going on for the most part. Bigger teams, you have to reinforce communication. And that's what those kind of team meetings are for. As you grow, you will start to realize that the intangibles of communication start to make a big impact on your company. You're going to want more ideas. You're going to want more innovation. You want more people heading in the right direction. And those are all things that aren't possible without as good communication. And it's something that we're always trying to improve. But great ideas really come from kind of one idea meshing with another idea, and it's people seeing one thing from their perspective, and in their world, everything's working one way. And then somebody else comes in and introduces, well, this is what's going on. And then that person says, oh, really? Okay, well, if I grab that idea and I put it with what my experience is, then we can have a great idea to be efficient. And it's only through communication that really a lot of that is possible. So you really want to get people in a room. You want to show people where your results are coming from, and how you're achieving those results. And that's the intangibles that come from that communication are super valuable to bigger teams.
Right. You're putting people in a position where they are exposed to multiple perspectives. And I think especially in an environment where there are a lot of specialists, it's very easy to get tunnel visioned on, this is what I want. And a phrase that I use a lot as well is, that's great, but we need to avoid one step forward, two steps back. Whereas if I'm just going, tunnel vision, full force ahead on one particular initiative without recognizing the impact on the rest of the ecosystem, that's where we get into these positions where a team starts to get fragmented, that people start to resent one another. And I think you've done a really tremendous job being able to keep these complementary resources and make sure that everybody is aware of what is necessary to drive forward without adding too much. I think that's one of the main things that people struggle with these types of meetings, where they give too much information, or it's something where you're spending an hour and a half listening to somebody drone on about things that affect a completely different department but have no impact on you. I think one of the things that you've done extremely well is being able to make everything relatable to everybody in a meeting, which is challenging in any environment. Marketing, as in anything in business, to be able to go in there and make sure that the people understand, yes, I'm engaged, I'm interested. This isn't something where you look around and you see eyeballs rolling in the back of your head. You're able to say, everybody needs to know this. I've distilled it down to the key points here, and that's what's going to allow us as a group to be successful.
Yeah, I mean that if I can just accomplish what you just said, then that's probably one of the biggest impacts I can make in my current role. So I hope I'm accomplishing what you mentioned.
So one of the things that really resonates with a lot of our listeners, we love to try to give tools, because everybody wants to say, oh, okay, the strategies are great, but how do I go about making this happen? So talk to us a little bit about kind of the everyday essentials that you have, the things that allow you to accomplish, good communication, but also to accomplish the blocking and tackling that is necessary for these web assets to succeed.
Yeah, I mean, this has changed so much over the years, and tools are only really as, how you use them. There's so many tools out there, and there's so many good ones for so many different things. Most of the tools that I use are pretty simple. Slack for communication. I'm a big fan of Slack and company communication.
It's something that we've implemented here at Knucklepuck over the past probably 2 to 3 months, and it's really been tremendous. Some of the integrations with different tools are really outstanding.
Yeah, and it's just such a great, team communication tool. BaseCamp for project management and seeing kind of new things that are being developed and providing feedback on where projects are headed.
One of the things that BaseCamp for us has been so successful is as new people join the team, then you're not saying, oh, well, let me forward you these 50 emails from the past 2 months. You have that kind of central repository. So it's been that, for me, that's the best way that we've used BaseCamp, is it facilitates an onboarding of new resources by having that knowledge transfer be a little bit more formalized and structured, as opposed to relying on one person or a select few to pass along all of that information.
That's a good point. I hadn't even really, I know that that's the main reason that BaseCamp's good, but I almost wonder now how we could incorporate BaseCamp into training at some point. And maybe there's a lot of older BaseCamp threads that we can actually go back to and just compile those almost as a training manual for onboarding. Yeah. That might be something that might be worth doing. I like that. And then a big one is Salesforce. We talked about customer generation before. being able to house your data in one place and start to understand your users, that's really what we use Salesforce for. And it's such a powerful tool to kind of compile everything into, and starting to understand what your customers are doing and how many customers you're generating and where you're generating your customers, all of that. That's really kind of a huge tool for me.
Goes back to what you mentioned before with data integrity. You have to have the information, and it has to be able to kind of talk to itself before you can really extract those insights.
Yeah. In previous roles, and I still dabble in these because I'm really kind of an SEO at heart. Google Analytics, Majestic SEO, Screaming Frog, SEMrush, kind of touch every single little tool. And I like to see all of them because I feel like each one of them is flawed in some specific way, but they all give you an overview. Like as you compile all of that information, you start to get a real good overview of kind of the performance of a web property. And so there's everything. Probably the one that I still use the most is obviously analytics and tracking, because there is so much information there about your users and your property and all
right.
that.
And Nate and I have actually done at least 1 or 2 episodes specifically focused on analytics, when your analytics could lie to you. Having a full and complete understanding of the picture, again, tying that back to customer acquisition and retention, all that, to be able to take that data-driven approach.
Yep. Certainly true.
So let's go back to the, now we're starting, hey, we have got a startup. You're going to say, all right, well, now I'm going to go do an entirely new project, start from day one, for people who have kind of that entrepreneurial itch to them. When you say, all right, what are going to be the kind of core pieces that you need on that team? If you were going to bootstrap a team and you wanted to bring on 4 people that were going to allow you to go from startup to scale, what are kind of those key attributes of those key personnel that you get in on day one?
This is an interesting question because I don't know. It really kind of depends on your goals. I think that there are certain people that are invaluable because they, when we talked a little bit about the generalists who can do so many different things. A good example of this is, something in the dev world that's kind of referred to as a unicorn, which is somebody who has kind of great design and branding skills and can do front end development, and has the ability to kind of implement and convey marketing concepts and copy and all of that. If you have somebody like that, your team's going to be, it's going to be so much easier to do stuff. But each person can be kind of a unicorn. And what I'm saying about that is that really people don't fall into really easy categories. Especially in smaller teams, you're going to have people who have multiple different skill sets. So I think you would want to find people who are more generalists, who would be able to jump in and write something if they had to, or do keyword research if they had to, or do outreach. And then you'd want kind of technical people who had a lot of experience with a lot of different technologies. So I think if you were a 4-person team, I think the biggest thing that you'd want to do is you'd want to restrict yourself from hiring specialists, especially if you've got to do everything yourself. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're looking at a person on the team and really they're only going to solve one piece of this puzzle that's at least 12, 15 pieces, I would be biased towards not having that person on that team because I think you're not putting them in a situation where they can succeed. You're going to want to be biased towards hiring generalists is what I would say.
I think especially at the beginning, that's so important because a specialist is you got to give them the work to sustain it. A specialist has very unique and specialized skills that they can use. And if there isn't enough of that foundation, that framework for it to be successful, that's something where you're not going to get the full value. Your return on a specialist is really not that high until you kind of get past that initial startup phase.
Yep. That's 100% true.
So Now that we have that bootstrap team, we started to build it. We're actually starting to look on, to the point where a specialist might be it's time to bring them on. And so the business is growing. There's profitability there. You're starting to have good communication across the team. But what is the most challenging part? Because everybody likes to kind of look at startups with this, rose-colored glasses here to say, oh, the startup life, the entrepreneurial life is great. Like it's so awesome, sensationalized. But there are a lot of challenges to it. What is the most challenging part to scaling that business, and kind of what's that tipping point, that make or break, whereas you either have to solve certain fundamental problems or the business is going to fail?
I think there's two topics there. In terms of like scaling a business, you have to have a solid culture and you have to work on communication. You also need to have people in the right roles and solving the problems that they're suited to solve. This is when kind of identifying specialists is really important and knowing when you need one. If you have a great culture and you put people in the right positions, then you'll win. Then you will be able to scale. If you're finding yourself in this situation where you're in kind of this make or break moment, what I would say is, do you have all your eggs in one basket? If you don't, then identify why you're failing. Really, the only kind of true failures are when you don't learn. If you can fail and learn and improve, then you're going to be okay. And what I would suggest is fail faster, and find ways to iterate and fail quicker. Because you'll learn from that, and you may have 10 failures and one success, but as long as that one success kind of outweighs all of those smaller failure points, you're going to be fine.
You talk about it in Eric Ries, who wrote The Lean Startup, which we've referenced quite a bit on the podcast, talks about the build, measure, learn feedback loop. To be able to say, create a hypothesis, build a hypothesis, test it in something that you can actually measure against, and then learn from it. And then repeat and repeat and repeat as quickly and as often as possible. The goal of the lean startup methodology is to move through that build, measure, learn feedback loop as quickly as possible, to not be afraid of your failures, but to be able to make sure that you are putting yourself in a position where you can gain a higher perspective and a higher understanding than you did before you went in there and produced the test.
Yeah, and I think if you come to that understanding, then you've failed in this one little area, but what you've gained from that failure is what's going to allow you to have the success the next time you iterate. And so now here's the thing. If all your eggs are in one basket, and there's really only one way to attack kind of a make or break moment, and that's blood, sweat, and tears. I mean, there's really kind of determination is key here. I would suggest not to put all your eggs in one basket, but that's not always the case. Sometimes all your eggs are just in one basket, and you've got to be determined, and you got to push through.
And I think that's interesting about that is you have to create a culture where that is understood, where that, to be able to say, all right, if there are going to be failures or if the eggs are in one basket, everybody on the team needs to know that. And I'm glad you started to kind of introduce the concept of culture, because I think that's something that is the most challenging to define. It's the most challenging to try to create or to force on a particular culture. And I know it's something that you and I have talked about at length, something that is a high priority for you in the way that you build your team and you facilitate that communication. And culture is like the free space in buzzword bingo these days. Everybody wants to talk about culture. And in Silicon Valley, they had one of the guys says, "Oh, I don't think this is a culture fit," and everybody freaked out at the implication that there wasn't a culture fit for a startup seeking funding. And I think that it's a heavy focus for a lot of people for a reason, because I would almost argue that can be your make and break moment. If your culture doesn't put yourself in a position to accomplish the goals that have been outlined by the organization, that is something where that is a fundamental issue that must be addressed. So talk to me a little bit about how you've gone either building or, continuing to evolve the culture that you have established for your team.
Yeah. So, culture is interesting because I think that sometimes people look at it from an inverted point of view. And what I would say about that is that people from the top of a company try to instill a culture towards the lower levels of a company. And it's actually kind of the other way around, where the way I see it is really it's kind of the habits and values of kind of the bottom of your team, and it kind of comes up. And so the way that culture works is that it's always changing. When you start at a company and you've been there for the first couple of years, you will have a specific culture that you won't always be able to nail down, but you have an idea of kind of the habits and values of the people who are there. And as you grow or as you change, 5-10 years down the road, you'll find that those initial habits and initial values of the team are different. And that is really the culture, is the habits and the values of your team at this present moment. And that's always going to change. I think that from the top, really what you're going to want to do is really incorporate it into your communication and into your recruitment. And as much as it is a situation of you defining it, it's not you really defining it as much as it's you identifying it and reflecting it and making sure that your values and your culture are being maximized to improve your company.
And I think it's something where it's interesting to talk about that inverse pyramid, because it requires the people kind of at the management level to do more listening than speaking. To have something where you have to listen to what your team is telling you that they value. Listen and what type of events resonates with that team, what builds kind of that camaraderie and that teamwork and that kind of sense of fulfillment. How can you provide something, what you're going to provide for a content team is going to be different than for a development team. To be able to have an opportunity for them to kind of collaborate, but to have a one-size-fits-all approach is really what can torpedo culture, in my experience, where the needs of, we'll give a TV reference for this. So How I Met Your Mother was my favorite TV show for years and years and years. How I Met Your Mother also had arguably the worst end of the series that I've ever seen, to the point where I can't watch reruns of it. And what it kind of came down to is that the creators had a vision for how the show would end on episode 1 and were unwilling to change that vision 8 years down the road at the end of the season. And the characters had changed. The audience relationship with the characters had changed. But they were unwilling to accept an evolution in the way that their vision has evolved, to kind of go back and use the same word twice in a row. But from a management level and from people who are involved in growing and building these teams, there has to be that appreciation for what your team is telling you that they value and telling you that this is how we want to define our culture, that it's going to change. It's going to change every time you have a new person come on board, every time that you have a new project that you're going to start, a new partnership or relationship with an external organization. Culture is something, in my experience, that is very, very hard to pin down. It's like trying to hold water, but you kind of just have to let it fill and move in the way that it wants to, and to be able to learn how to swim with the current and react to it, as opposed to try to impose a culture on your team.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good analogy. I have not seen How I Met Your Mother, but I've heard a lot about it. And I think you've kind of identified a situation where basically they did not understand their user base. They did not understand the people who were interacting with their product and where they were. And they probably wanted to instill their own initial vision without understanding that, listen, their vision was changing the entire time, which is definitely the case, and it happens with culture as well.
So as we kind of wrap up here, we're in the January, so almost an obligation to talk about, what are the future of marketing? What are the trends here? But I'd be interested in kind of in your perspective as we look towards, this year or even beyond. Where do you see kind of this whole concept, this whole field of marketing going, specifically as, digital changes constantly? The digital landscape is different now than it was at the start of January, let alone what it's going to be at the end of this year and beyond. So In your opinion, kind of where is this field going? And if we want to remain kind of on that cutting edge and remain innovative, what do we have to be able to embrace as marketing continues to evolve?
So, in our industry, for years and years and years, a lot of it was, let's call them marketing schemes in some way to kind of manipulate the algorithm. I think we're seeing those just being less and less every day. And I feel like that's going to continue, especially with the search engines and anyone who's providing content to anybody, Facebook or whatever, is going to try to have a strategy in place to minimize any sort of scheme from a digital marketer. So I think kind of less schemes is definitely something that's going to be part of future of digital marketing. I think there's going to be a bigger focus on digital marketing over traditional marketing, primarily because you can focus on the things that impact your users at a very granular level. Data, understanding your users' actions, how you're generating customers, all of that is easier on digital than it is through traditional means.
And digital gives you that opportunity to fail faster.
Yeah.
When you had the old tradition, you have to go, we got to go to print. We got to go and see as it slowly reacts. Where digital gives you immediate response. It's very vulnerable, really, to do marketing in the digital landscape because the feedback and the responses are so immediate and direct. But I think that if you're able to leverage that as an asset, as opposed to something that is, that freaks you out or that intimidates you, but to be able to recognize that as an asset, but also something that should be respected in terms of how quickly you're going to get feedback from that user base.
Yeah. And so, from a digital perspective, I feel that the future is better data integrity, better user and persona targeting, better, bigger focus on personalization and just more testing in general and really understanding the feedback from your customers and your users.
I love it. So our regular listeners always appreciate kind of the way that we wrap up each one of these episodes as we talk about our rapid fire tips segment. And so for our folks who are looking to build a brand, whether they're currently in that startup phase or if they're in the scale phase, what are kind of the key takeaways that people need to embrace to grow and sustain a successful business?
I would say kind of plan, but don't over plan. Brands grow over time. They change.
Cultures grow.
Right. And you're going to want to continue to kind of identify that and then move with kind of that growth. Find ways to communicate with your users and get really good at tracking their feedback and their actions. If you have that feedback loop, then you'll be able to continually kind of optimize in that way. And really focus on developing great content assets. You got the whole content is king mantra. It's pretty corny, but it really has a basis in reality where you should be focusing most of your time on coming up with great content assets and providing those to people. And if you do that, then your brand will grow.
Great. Well, David, I really want to thank you for your time today and coming and joining us on the show. If people wanted to have a chance to reach out and connect with you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Email is probably the easiest. I'm always on email. So just david@launchthat.com is my email address. If you want to find me on Twitter, at David Palombo, Palombo.
Very nice. And we'll make sure that we have that up in the show notes. And so you can find previous episodes, links to things that we've mentioned, and our contact information on bamboochalupa.com. We'd like to once again thank David for his time here. And for our listeners that don't want to miss another episode, please go and subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or your favorite podcast app. And while you're there, leave us a comment and a rating. Nate and I use a lot of this feedback to determine the topics that we're going to use, the type of guests that we're going to bring on. So we really appreciate your feedback. We want to take David's advice and listen to our user base to be able to create solid content, maybe not as much of the written content, but solid content for our folks here. And so for Nate Shiver, I am Brett Snyder. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Brett.